Hey everyone, welcome to the Centre Bounce. Today we're going to be talking about the West Coast Eagles, how they went in 2022, who they picked up, their list changes, and a look ahead to 2023. Big J, how's it going?
Really good, mate. How you doing?
Yeah, good. As you can tell, I'm well dressed today. Yes, I'm not my slobby self. I'm recording at work, so very dedicated I am. I guess you can say, but
Yeah.
you won't be able to tell. So the
Upgraded
internet's
the
better
digs.
here.
Put
Sorry.
in the work for the channel, huh? Upgraded the digs.
Yes, exactly. No, it's all for the internet, I suppose. It's all a lot of feedback last week that my internet is not good, and I agree. I have to work on that. But I guess for now we can work from after work hours, putting in the hard yards, and talk about the West Coast Eagles. If only it was my team, but it is what it is. Yeah, the Eagles were a weird one this year, weren't they? I'm not sure if a lot of people had high expectations for these guys. Did you have much expectation for them?
Um, I guess I kind of was thinking that they would finish pretty similar to kind of where they did finish on the ladder. So second last. I know the last couple of years beforehand they were fairly close and had been dealing with injuries, things like COVID, that kind of thing. Obviously, WA rules were a little bit further behind than what like Victoria was, for example. So yeah, I mean, I see West Coast as kind of in a bit of a transition year. I know they're thinking that they're not, but kind of from the outsider's perspective, see them in a bit of a transition year where the older players are getting older. The likes of Kennedy's, getting pretty old. Nick Nack's, not a spring chicken anymore. And then, yeah, the younger kids kind of have to try and take over, but I just don't kind of see where that's going to happen. The younger kids, they have at least the AFL experienced ones, either are really injured or really inexperienced. So I guess kind of 17th on the ladder like we have here is pretty fair for what they are. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, they were really decimated with COVID themselves
Yeah.
this year. In addition to injuries to various other players, like I know Oscar Allen, for example, he's so important for him, and he wasn't able to get out on the park. Yeah, like the likes of Yo, for example, and Sheeds. There's a lot of really important players that simply weren't able to get on the park or stay on the park anywhere near as consistently enough for this team. And I mean, they had to rely on top up players this year for goodness sake. You know what I mean? Like we had that was a really interesting discussion point in Supercoach last year. Like we're getting all these players added to the game, and they were all really cheap. So there was a lot of downgrade targets, I suppose, from the Eagles last year. So the fact that they managed to win 2 games, I'm not surprised at all. And their percentage just goes to show how uncompetitive they were for the vast majority of the season. They only won 2 games. This one that we've got here as their best performance, who the hell knows how they beat Collingwood this year at Marvel Stadium? That was bizarre. And the other game was when they beat us. But of course, beating us was no tough job this year that's gone by. So definitely beating Collingwood was up there. And yeah.
I guess it kind of shows though as well that like when the team is firing, then it still is competitive, right? Obviously Collingwood, I think this was around where they did have a little bit of a form slump. Obviously you can see 10-14 as being their score. So if they had kicked a couple more goals instead of behinds, they would have won. But just kind of similar to a lot of teams in the AFL, when they're on, and a lot of their older players, coming in clutch, working out for them. But injuries and COVID-ins, like you say, kind of hampered that quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And they had to move away from their state for quite some time. And I know there was a lot of complaining from people at the Eagles. And I guess rightfully so. I mean, when you've been forcibly moved away from your home, and there were a lot of hurdles that they had to jump over. So I guess it can definitely be excused. And you can tell that within the 4 walls of that club, they, even till now, don't seem to be too concerned about this year that's gone by. seeing it more as an aberration. And I think they're still willing to back in a lot of their big names. Like we're hearing that Yo, for example, is back on the track and flying. You got Oscar Allen, who's back on the track, and he's also doing really well, ready to step up and take Kennedy's role. So I think there's a lot of optimism still for the Eagles, the biggest team in the land, and that this year was really just an aberration for them. Still, like as you say, I'm not quite exactly sure how they're going to get that next wave of talent coming through if they don't try and at least rebuild a little bit. Their younger players really are inexperienced. But we have a good friend named Shaq, and he sings praises of the Waffle and how there's so many really talented players that slip through the cracks and pass under the radar from all these other clubs here on the east side of the country, and they're just left to pick up these great players. And then there's the go home factor as well. A lot of I think we've seen most recently with Kelly, right? When he left Geelong.
Well, and we've just seen Luke Jackson as well. So,
yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah. I guess we've talked about it in our Sydney review, but kind of non-Victorian bias. A lot of these teams and a lot of kind of the Waffle and the Sandful, we don't really see a lot of, just because they're not, we can't go down and watch the games. The track watchers aren't there as much or don't post as much about them. So as you're saying, you can kind of pick up these sneaky players who maybe have been under a lot of teams' noses, but, WA kind of, who's that player in the draft? Whenever that kind of pops up, they're really good at doing that.
Yeah, like I can definitely attest to Nick Martin. Nick Martin came from the Subi system, and I love him to bits. And I thank Subi and the West Coast so much for helping to develop Nick Martin before coming across to us. But anyway, that's enough kicking of West Coast for now. I think we'll talk about who they brought into their team. They only brought one guy in, and that's Jayden Hunt. And that one came really, to me, it came left field. Did you see this one happening?
I think it's probably a position on field that they need. A lot of their guys, as we've alluded to before, are getting a bit older. So having someone, obviously Hunt can run for days and is a really good player that way. So adding that kind of to their engine room is really important for them. As your Dom Sheed and Yo and those kind of players come back to fitness, but they're still a bit older. Hunt's not a spring chicken, I think he's 27 this year, but he does give that kind of run game for them. I think we'll speak about who they brought in. This year, the Eagles really didn't give up a lot or didn't have a lot of trade value, like as they wanted to spend in the trade period. So picking up a player, I think Hunt was a free agent, right? So picking him up, fringe player at a good club, now comes in and will probably play 22 games at the Eagles pretty easily. So great pickup for them. As you say, maybe a bit of left field, we didn't really see it happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also because Jayden Hunt, as you say, he can run for days. And it's also important to note that Optus Stadium, the on-field dimensions are the same as the MCG. So you've got someone who's played a lot of games at the MCG, playing for a grand final winning team from obviously not this season that's gone by, but the previous season with Melbourne. Obviously, they have a sensational system and they've got a great culture in place, which pushes for excellence. And for this young team, that's becoming increasingly younger as their older players start to transition out and a lot more responsibility starts getting placed on these younger players. Having an experienced head like Jayden Hunt, who's still well and truly in the prime of his career, 27 years old, is still squarely, I think, in the physical prime, especially of the modern day footballer, if not even 28, for example. It's still in their prime. It's the age just keeps going up, and players are able to play for longer as teams continue to improve on the science, I suppose, and the fitness. So having a guy that's able to run all day, maintain his width on the wide ground, as well as lead, I think that's a great acquisition. And Melbourne weren't really complaining much because they picked up Hunter, Lockie Hunter from the Dogs anyway. So it just all seemed to play out neatly, I guess, in this trade period. And like you said, they got him for free, being a free agent. So it's great that West Coast still can be considered like a destination club, despite all of the issues that they had during the off season.
I
We
think he
can
might
move
have
on.
also been. I think he might have also been a Perth-based player as well. So picked up, going back home, seeing family, that kind of thing was a big draw card for Hunt as well.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense to me. I guess then we can start talking about the departures then, because seeing as they didn't really gain much in terms of arrivals through the trade, probably the biggest name that's retired, I would say, would be Josh Kennedy, a much beloved big star of the game, and it's always an interesting discussion when you when you have a Carlton fan and an Eagles fan who won who won that trade. Judd to Carlton and Kennedy to the Eagles. This is one of those rare situations where you can say both teams really, really won. It's crazy to say, but Kennedy's been insane, and he single handedly beat us when we played them this year. He scored so many goals for him, and it was so wonderful that he reached his milestone in front of his home crowd. Everyone, all the love, all the adulation, the big screen, the light show at Optus. He's definitely one of the legends of the game. Do you have any fond memories of Kennedy during his career?
I guess kind of just like a lot of those flying marks he used to do. Something you don't see as much with the big-bodied key forwards. I guess kind of he was the last remnants of, your John O'Brien, Rewalt, those kind of big, key forward type players that would run into the pack and just put their arms up and grab it, right? It's funny, if you talk to a lot of St Kilda fans, and I think Kane Corns has been pushing it for a while, trying to get him back out of retirement. So maybe he's got another year, we'll see what happens. But yeah, just kind of always being that threat down forward. As he got older, he wasn't, running as much, that kind of thing. But if you sent the ball into the Eagles forward line, he'd probably get a mark and then they'd score a goal. So that'd be kind of the memories for me there.
Yeah, I can't forget Twinkle Toes. The stutter setup is the walking in is that was a lot. That was great. It was great to watch. Definitely not textbook perfect, but it worked for him and he was great. Jack Redden also retired this year from the Eagles, and probably the only player that they lost really in terms of departure out of their hands was Junior Rioli, gone to Port. Do you reckon that this will be a good move for Rioli to go to Port Adelaide?
It's interesting. I guess kind of he's getting a bit older, and we've talked about players playing in their prime, right? So Port Adelaide are hopefully pushing for finals again this year. West Coast, obviously, I think are on the bottom end of a rebuild. So jumping ship that way definitely helps for him. I know there's been a few like off-field issues, that kind of thing. Obviously, dealing with the Gatorade saga as well. So maybe just a good change of pace, that kind of thing. Coming to an established team for players like this definitely helps. I know we've seen the same with like a Tyson Stengel, how he went, had some off-field issues, had some problems, went to Geelong and has done really well for them. So maybe Rioli's kind of in the same mold that way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I'd also say that his loss can hurt, I think, the Eagles a little bit. His partnership with Fly and Ryan was something really great. The Indigenous connection that they had there, and they did really well passing the ball to each other and set each other up. So they might have to rely a bit more on Liam Ryan to work his way up the ground, but he's so great in front of goal. You would really hope that he gets given more support at ground level, I think, moving forward. We've got Oscar Allen coming back to fill in Kennedy's shoes as a key forward, but you just feel that if they had some more support at ground level, losing Rioli, I don't think they really wanted that to happen. And I think there was a bit of negative commentary that he owed his team when they really stood by him and supported him at a low point in his life and in his career. For him to make the decision to leave to Port Adelaide, I think a lot of people weren't happy about that. Do you have an opinion on that? I know it's a bit of a touchy subject, but I mean, we haven't really been able to speak touchy with all of these teams. Teams are so well drilled these days.
I guess it's not like we talk about Gatorade. Like, it's not like that situation happened and then he retired and then his suspension was finished and then he went play for another club. Rioli did play some games at West Coast and then swapped over. So he came back, kind of did what he did. I'm not a big fan of people saying, obviously, if you're a fan, you want him to stay, good X Factor player for West Coast, that kind of thing. But I'm not a huge fan in the AFL of like, oh, this player owes us this, whatever. You're still getting the player throughout the season. They're still putting in the work. They're still getting paid, that kind of thing. So, yes, it would have been nice for him to stay. But if the player wants to move and the clubs are happy to facilitate that, then it gets done. Yeah, that's kind of my view on it. I'm not a big stickler of, players should only be one club players. If they have some turmoil or whatever, then, they have to stay. It's kind of just like, if you can get what you can get out of the trade period and you're happy that way, then it's a win-win for both parties. If you wanted to stay, you would stay.
Yeah, I agree. Because we were in a similar situation with Joey Danaher. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, this guy's been paid big bucks over all these years, and he's not playing out there because of injury. So he owes the club. He should come back and play." You do get a lot of that commentary with players, but at the end of the day, I mean, I think player movement is something that should be encouraged. It's great for the game. It's great for teams. To give themselves a sniff that they can really improve their list if they're able to lure another great player in from another team. It could also, yes, it's a double-edged sword. You could end up in a situation like we saw with Richmond, or Geelong. You see a team on the rise and you just want to go and join them and jump along to easier way to get to success. But on the flip side, there has been a lot of times where a player has left, a la like Gary Ablett Jr., how he left the Cats to go to the Suns on a big contract, so favorite son can still move. It is what it is. And until things change, which I don't think they will, such as the game, and it shouldn't be touched.
I guess as well, you've seen times when the player wants to go, but then the club doesn't trade them. So like Tim Kelly, after his first year, that kind of thing. I think Lobb as well has been trying to get out of Perth for a while. So that trade obviously happened this year. But I think last year he was pretty desperate to come to, and, teams couldn't facilitate that trade. So if they're out of contract, yes, you can do kind of what you like. But once you sign that contract, to a certain extent, you have to kind of honor it that way.
Yeah, very, very true. I guess we move on to the delistings now. Any names from these guys that really jump out to you that you're really interested in or surprised? Consider them a bit stiff?
Obviously, like some names from Supercoach, Hugh Dixon, Patrick Naish, who came from Richmond, had a go at West Coast, that kind of thing. But not really. It seemed kind of like a lot of unknown players who maybe didn't make the biggest splashes on the field. We've talked about some other clubs guys that maybe were best 22 who got delisted, how badly that was. But Hugh Dixon, for example, was in and out of the team. Tom Joyce, probably the same. Zach Langdon did play a few games, but similar story, in and out depth player. Naish as well did some things. So not really, no. Not as impactful as other clubs. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I'm not sure also if the decision to delist a couple of them was also in relation to wasn't there an incident during the season last year? There was a nightclub thing where you had players, and I think Hugh Dixon was among them and was very quickly dropped and never given a game, I think, after that point. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of the reasoning behind this is also just due to culture and looking to improve the culture. Junior Rioli probably also leaving from the club. So it looks like there's going to be a new sort of environment maybe around there at the Eagles, looking to try and push for maybe higher standards, as well as, because I think they rate their list fairly highly, and they probably expect to do better than what they have. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to hear a lot of good reports coming out of the Eagles over this preseason about this guy's flying on the track. This guy's going to be great. I think we're already starting to hear some of it. Not. I wouldn't be surprised if there's people considering this to just be puff pieces to try and win some memberships over. But I think as we get closer to the season starting, we'll probably hear more. And I think what we'll hear a lot more about also are some of these players that they've picked up. None more so than I think Ruben Jimby, the inside mid that they picked at pick 9. This guy, I think, he's really impressive. He doesn't have that crazy X factor, but what he does have is he has a lot of these great traits that recruiters all over the country would really appreciate him having in the modern game. He's a fairly big size. He's 189 centimeters, and he initially was playing in the back line before being thrown into the midfield for some reason. But what a move it turned out to be. He's big. He's a powerful athlete. He's got a ready-made frame. So I can really see that this guy is going to get a lot of minutes in the Eagles' best 22. Do you know much about Elijah Hewitt that they picked with pick 14?
Before I kind of touch on him, we might just kind of explain. So West Coast obviously had the second pick in the draft. They came in and traded with, I think it was a bit of a four-way trade, right? GWS, Port, North, and West Coast, obviously. Turned their pick 2 into 2 picks inside the top 20, which was really good for them. And it kind of allowed them to pick up these players. So guys that, maybe weren't touted to be the first couple of picks, but as we've spoken about off field and on video as well, that there is some real gems in the later part, especially of the first round. And Jimmy and Hewitt definitely fill that mark as well. So Hewitt had a really big waffle season last year. Really good midfield prospect for them. Can play a little bit of forward as well as midfield. So it kind of fills a niche role that they need with a lot of their older players coming in. These kind of guys who can play multiple spots as well generally start earlier because they're not like a pure midfielder, right? If the kid's fitness isn't there, they can't play pure mid. But because they can play multiple roles, or you can rest forward, rotate a couple of times during the game, that kind of thing. Didn't average a huge amount of disposals in his lower level, but that's definitely something you can build on. A lot of the time as well, these guys, if they come from a stacked team, how many teams in the AFL can have multiple players getting 30 disposals? You just can't do it because they don't pass the ball that much. So maybe he builds on that a little bit, but great pickup for them and really good player to build for the future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have players, if you have teams where you have multiple players picking up 30 disposals, that's probably because they're handballing backwards and forwards without making any gains. And I'm speaking of the likes of the Darcy Parishes of the world that we saw have he had something like 30 odd disposals to half time against Collingwood for like 20 meters gained. It was something ridiculous. I guess the next player then along here, Harry Barnett, he was the first ruckman that was drafted at pick 23. So I guess that goes to show, where the league is going, I suppose, and how highly it views or not so highly it views ruckman these days. But Harry Barnett, he was ranked, categorized as elite in both aerial ability and strength. So he did quite well in the ruck contests, and it's not because he's, despite him having elite aerial ability, he's a thick boy, and he was quite hard to move in stoppages. So you can think of him almost like one of those Jared Witts sort of thing, like very hard to move, but he still has great aerial ability, and he uses it to take a lot of contested marks. And he's got good second efforts in him. The only thing with this guy is, depending on the day, you might have to flip a coin to see if his disposal will be any good. He's got quite poor disposal efficiency, which he would have to work hard on to really, I suppose, make himself be more of a threat, especially up forward. He can also really need to improve on his impact on the scoreboard. But in terms of an ability to pinch it in the ruck and really be a support with second efforts, I consider him like a younger version of like an Andrew Phillips, for example, someone who doesn't early on in his career didn't have a lot of great disposal, but had a good size and an ability to jump. So Harry Barnett, it's a question whether or not he's ready to go to help out with Nick Nat, especially now that Oscar Allen is up and running. It's really a question, I suppose, of how much they want Oscar Allen coming off injury, how much they want to throw him into the ruck. And now that Kennedy's gone, they probably would want Oscar Allen to stay more forward, to really be that stay-at-home forward that Kennedy was. So he might get some games this year to help Nick Nat out, but really only time will tell, I suppose.
Yeah, and they've really struggled as well we've spoke about Hugh Dixon, I know Bailey Williams as well. They've really struggled with that player to try and find that player who's going to come in and be the second player to Nick Nat. So maybe Harry Barnett can actually do that for them, which would be fantastic, obviously, for Supercoach, but also for West Coast as well. Kind of surely signing up that player, especially after missing out on Luke Jackson, in the trade period. Because he wanted to go back home. Freo got the services, but West Coast were kind of looking for him as well.
Yeah, I agree. I personally found that a little bit cheeky / that Luke Jackson wants to go back home, but really, how much thought did he put into going to West Coast? Like, how much did he want to go to West Coast? I don't know. If you want to go home, I understand you want to go home. You got 2 clubs at home, but if you want to go specifically to one team at home, being a bit more upfront about it definitely wouldn't hurt. I guess we move on to Kobe. You know much about Kobe?
I guess kind of him being a mid forward as well. So West Coast, I think, really see their defense as kind of being the strong point in the team. Hence, if you have a look at all these guys, they're either forwards or they're mid forwards or they're complete forwards. Obviously, Barnett's a ruck, so he kind of adds to that nice engine room as well. One of those players, I think that we've spoken about before about how the hype kind of affects the draft a little bit. The first 25 or so players are really talked about, and you can get some real gems in the second half of the draft. So Virgil kind of takes over that role as well. Really good, underrated player who I think his team, I think it might be the Oakley Chargers. They had a lot of really good players coming through that team, and West Coast have done a good job picking him up there. Maybe not the first 1 or 2 players who were the best 1 or 2, but if you can get 3, 4, 5, 6 for a pick in the 20s, you're pretty happy with that, right? Really good player that way. Heard he's a bit of like a Zach Merritt type clone. He can play that kind of role. Good in the midfield, but really nice lead up and passing between midfield and forward as well. So building on the young kids, but could play early for them.
Yeah, I guess that's the goal. I would imagine that's the goal for the Eagles, that they really want to have to try and really start giving these youngsters and some exposure and really fast track their development. They have an aging list, and as much as they want to hold on and really try and get the most out of the aging stars that they've still got on their team, I think it's really important that they really start to give a lot of opportunity to these young guys to really come in and give it a shot. Someone who looked like he was going to struggle to have a shot with early injuries was Noah Long, who they picked up at pick 58. But he somehow it worked out for him. He had some early injuries. He injured his knee, and then he had a collision where in the first game of the season where he injured his collarbone. And he was destined, it looked like he was going to be playing inside mid, a pure inside mid. But because of his injuries, he was given more outside game and playing that striker sort of position, like that Dusty role, except he's, predominantly forward and then pinch hitting in the middle. It really worked for him. He uncovered that this guy can actually be a really potent, dangerous forward. And I think they really picked him up because he's got great forward craft and he can use his hands and his to gather the ball really well, great at ground level, and his conversion was really impressive. So I think they picked him up knowing as well that they lost Junior Rioli and that they probably needed more assistance in the forward line. It's probably why they picked him up. And at pick 58, his upside is actually really great for that pick. I think they certainly did well with this selection. And if he can just simply work on his endurance and his outside game, he will get more mid time. And I'm pretty sure he wants to have more mid time as well. And then he can really play. I don't know if it's hard to say that the goalie is playing more mid time, but he can really develop into that exact mold of player, except with more mid time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think as well, kind of, you talk about endurance. Well, these are kids who are playing at a lower level as well, so kind of needing to build their endurance is pretty fair. You very rarely find kids, maybe it's Sam Walsh, who comes into the system and dominates straight away, especially in like a midfield type role. But kids playing lower level, less tackles, that kind of thing, moving to the AFL system, building endurance is pretty normal, I think. They've picked up a couple of Category B rookies as well. So guys, basically, they get for free, maybe through their academy, or just players they kind of know, maybe from the waffle, that kind of thing. Jordan Baker, another wingman player, so wingman forward who can play really well. Didn't average the highest scores, but for free, he's pretty good. Playing for East Perth, so another homegrown talent. You don't have to worry about the go-home factor with these players. And it's something I'll kind of touch on as well, is that go-home factor for these WA clubs is probably the worst thing that they can have. So guys that, maybe at junior level or as they get older, it's like, hey, I want to move back home. New South Wales and Victoria, it's only like an hour away. Geelong's only like an hour away. From Queensland, it's not so bad. But Perth is so far that these guys, especially during something like COVID, they just want to stay home. So being able to pick up these Category B guys, and Hewitt and Jimmy as well, who maybe from that kind of area as well, is really important for them. And I know it's a big factor. And then they picked up Dewar as well. So another forward as well, Category B rookie, did quite well. He's kicked 14 goals in his last 8 games. So, maybe a bit of a project player at the moment, but he's Category B. They don't even have to pay for him on the salary cap. So, it's pretty good for free, right?
Oh yeah, it's massive wins. As you said, these guys are both from their Next Gen Academy. They get them for free. They can look at their game over a long period of time, away from the sights of the eastern side of the country. Again, just passing under the radar, and then they're both really exciting. Especially Dewar. He is, I think, like, his athleticism is off the charts. He is so great, and he started off at half back. He's one that I think a lot of Eagles fans should be really excited. He started off at half back before being moved into the forward line, and exactly as you said, he kicked like 14 goals in 8 games. So that's really impressive. He can play both sides of the ground as a very fast moving half back as well. So these guys, you can see that there's a lot of excitement to come. Again, all of them, most of them have to work on their fitness. But again, as you say, it's very normal. It's very standard. It is the most rigorous sport on the planet, involving a lot of running, a lot of jumping, and physical contact. So, getting bumped and getting tackled takes a lot out of you. So it's really impressive. I think that they're building for the future. A lot of project players here. Alongside players that are ready to get in and play right away. Jimby can get in and play right away. I think Hewitt can also get in and play right away. Barnett, it's a question of how he goes, I suppose, integrating into the team with the preseason and just how tall they want to go, because he can take contested marks. So, you've got a good blend of players ready to go now and long-term players in positions where I think they still see themselves having the star power to man up, I suppose, and to cover.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. I guess that brings us to the predictions for 2023. We reckon they get 5 wins, which is a ladder position, around 15 to 18. I guess it depends on the other teams around them and how many wins they each get. But bottom 4 seems to be on the cards. I know there are some people out there that are saying that, they expect them to jump a bit higher than out of the bottom 4. But I just think that given how old a lot of these stars are, it's not long before they're bound to get injured again. Obviously, you don't wish an injury on players, but as you get older, injuries become a lot more prevalent, and then they'll get really young really quickly, which will see some inconsistent performances. Um, can you see the reasons, the arguments for why some people think that they might jump out of the top four?
I guess I can. I can see kind of the reasoning for them to get 5 wins instead of 2, like they did this year. You know, the AFL is a funny thing where, as we saw with them versus Collingwood at the start, you know, one team can have a good game, one team can have a bad game. If that happens a couple more times, if they build on that consistency a little bit, they can probably pull a couple of wins out of nowhere that way. Just looking at their fixtures, though, I think they've got a lot of double ups on some really good teams in the AFL. So for them to kind of get more than that in 2023 is going to be pretty hard for them to do. Barring like, you know, Yo coming back to full fitness, Gaff, you know, coming back to 2018 form, Nick Nat dominating the league and being the number 1 ruckman, you know, Kennedy coming out of retirement for them. So, you know, random things like that happening, I don't think they're going to get much higher than what we've got here. 15th on the ladder would be a really big stretch for them. But I think kind of their age profile and where they want to be in the draft, that's probably a good thing for them. You don't want to put a team like this, having them have too much expectations kind of in this first real rebuild year. So kind of picking up another, top 4, top 5 pick for them, that potentially they can trade down for a couple more in that early spot like they did this year, would be really good. So I think that's probably a good spot for them.
Yeah, I agree. And we've spoken a lot about Kennedy retiring, and we've spoken a lot about Oscar Allen stepping up to take his position. Do you reckon we'll see a down, I suppose, a less performance out of their forward line? Because I think a lot of what kept them in games was their efficiency moving forward. What's Darling going to do? You know what I mean? Like, he's a name. He's been around for a long time, but it just doesn't seem like he's really taken charge and dominated. Can we see the forward line step up this year?
Well, I think Oscar Allen's probably one of them that has to. He's kind of forced into that position now. I know when he was playing, he did kick quite a few goals. But the problem with Darling, as you mentioned, that he's always, in my eyes at least, been the number 2, you know, being the backup guy, a little bit more mobile, but, you know, isn't the main target down forward. If he has to do that now, there may be some issues because I think he's not the tallest player either. Like Kennedy, I think, is close to 200. Darling's a little bit less. So it really kind of falls on the likes of Oscar Allen to come back from injury, and then play that real key forward role. So it's going to be tough for them, which is kind of why I think they might be a bit lower on the ladder as well. Just because coming back from injury, it's not like he's been a VFL guy that's come through. He's actually suffered the injuries and now is kind of getting get his body right there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it also depends a lot on how they structure up with their smalls, and how they're going to get, some goals from ground level. I don't know. I think the Eagles are an interesting team. Not a lot of expectations on them, which could mean that they're a bit of a surprise ticket. But I think a lot of it also comes down to whether or not they give their youngsters a lot of exposure. Like, if we see the likes of Campbell Chesser, if we see Tom Cole, if we see the players that they've drafted this year, if we see more of them play, can they take the game to another level? More of Greg Clark, for example, some of the more mature recruit there, but he's still quite young, I suppose, in terms of his career. If we see more of these youngsters play with the exuberance, the energy to really take the ball forward, which is a bit different from the traditional kick mark game style that we've seen Eagles play in the past, I guess that is also another factor in whether or not we'll see more excitement and more energy in that forward line. That's basically how I see it. It's just a question of how quickly, how much responsibility are they willing to give their young players this year? I think only time will tell. And whether or not they can really embrace the fact that they are in a rebuild, the beginning stages of a rebuild. I think if the quicker they come to realize that and actually give more responsibility to these youngsters, I think the more exciting of a season it will be moving forward, setting up the bigger picture.
How do you feel like Campbell Chesser and Tom Cole are going to kind of fit into everything? I know both are kind of on the second part of their injury recovery, so they should be playing, some fitness, that kind of thing. Do you really see them kind of slotting in? I know Chester as well, being a high draft pick a couple of years ago, they were hoping to get a lot more game time into him as kind of the more mature age players of the younger group. They've really got to step up and start impacting, right?
Yeah, I agree. I understand that you might have established stars on the team, and you're not willing to gift games to youngsters. They have to really earn it, I suppose. It sucks when you're injury riddled. I know I can speak for us. We picked up both Nick Cox and Zach Reed, and they're not as far as we would have hoped they would have gone by this stage due to their bodies failing. So I can only really hope that these guys do come out and perform. I know that there are reports that Tom Cole is in ripping shape in this preseason so far, and there are people that are considering having him in their starting team for Supercoach in the back line. So I can only imagine that they can only go up. One direction, that's up for these players. And it really comes down to whether or not they can take the opportunity with both hands, and whether Simpson is willing to give them the shot. They might need an injury to break into the team, but whether or not they can hold on is a different matter. Now, speaking of injury, can you see Hearn play as many games as he can this year, or how is he going to perform?
I think he's one of those players in the AFL. Obviously, he's fairly old now. I think he's like mid-30s, which is crazy that he's still playing. He really seems to be one of those players that will will himself into games. That if they're struggling, if there's not really the cover for him, he'll will himself into the game. With the new sub rule, where teams can basically just sub out a player at any point, he might he might start for early on, maybe plays 3 quarters and then get subbed off in the end, or maybe halfway through, just kind of depending on what he is, swaps out with someone else. That could definitely work for them. But I think he kind of has to, right? I think he really sees a lot of those mature older players, Kennedy types have left, that he's really the last age there. So his leadership, I think if he doesn't play, it's really going to hurt them. So he kind of has to.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I really do. But I just feel like as long as you're holding on to these old players, how committed are you to really bottoming out and really getting a full-blown rebuild happening, and giving game time into youngsters and giving them responsibility moving forward? Like, they must clearly rate their list, I suppose, and how far it can take them if they're willing to still hang on to people like Hearn. I understand his leadership is really immense. I would think that he can still offer all of that in an off-field sort of role, that could be made for him at the club, to work as maybe an assistant coach or a leadership coach or something like that. But they clearly still rate him, and I can only trust what the Eagles list manager has to say, and only time will tell, I suppose, with how he goes. I hope these youngsters really take as much up, make the most of his presence there in the team, I suppose, and learn as much as they can from him, because this really might be his last one, right? His last year.
And I guess they've got the likes of Bazzo coming through, and Witherden always, Witherden was brought in as the replacement for Hearn. So maybe, that actually happens and he gets to stand up and play more of that position, that kind of backline general. I think Hearn's key defending roles was something that they're really going to miss if they don't play him. So they've kind of just got to fill that, maybe with a Witherden or a Bazzo if he's ready, that kind of thing. They can do it. It's kind of just taking the leap, like you're saying.
Yeah, and when that happens, I think Witherden was going to be a lock in all of our backlines for Supercoach.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess that brings our discussion of the Eagles to a close.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts, Big J, about the Eagles or footy in general?
The one thing I've admired with the Eagles fans, similar to like Carlton, where it doesn't matter how well the team's going, the fans always show up, especially in Perth. I think they've got the biggest membership base maybe in that whole of the AFL. I don't know how many of those are Doggy Digital memberships, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, just like keep faith. 2018 was really good for you guys. You obviously won. So, anything can happen at any time. It's just kind of a bit of a transition year, couple of years down the bottom of the ladder, and then you guys will jump back up again.
Yep, I agree. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Please stay tuned to the Centre Bounce. We're putting out two more team reviews to come. Still got the Western Bulldogs and Port Adelaide, and then all of those review videos will be done. And then you'll find that a lot of our content will be primarily Supercoach content and keeping track of players over this preseason. So please like, subscribe, all that jazz, and we'll see you in the next video.